Hey guys, welcome to part 4 of your methods lecture series. We're going to start things off with a bit of a cool story for you. So here it goes. Okay, so the story that I would like to tell you about today is about this fella named Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas was a railroad worker in the 1840s, just like these fellas here. And his job was to blast rock to make way for the rails. So if you know anything about laying down railroad tracks, like we all do, so this is how it works, right? So if you're going to break rock, you need to first they drill a hole, right? First you make a hole in the rock. Then you put in some powder, gunpowder. Then you tamp that gunpowder down. You add some tamping material like some sand or some clay or something on top of that. There's a fuse running up from the powder through that sand and clay. The sand and clay keeps all of this explosion sort of down here instead of everything spraying upward. You light the fuse and you go on your way because you have exploded the rock that you came to explode. Okay, so that was Finn's job. Now here's what happened to Phineas while he was working. He basically had, as you can see from the article here, a horrible accident. Okay, so what happened was the powder exploded. Okay, he was tamping down the powder, and before he added the tamping material, the tamping rod struck a rock. The rock sparked. There was an explosion, and the explosion sent an iron instrument through his head, 1.25 inches in circumference and 3 feet and 8 inches in length, which he was using at the time, is what I'm going to assume that says. The iron entered on the side of his face, shattering the upper jaw and passing back of the left eye and out at the top of the head. So, kind of horrifying, right? The rod actually landed about 80 feet away from him, so it wasn't like it was like stuck there. It just flew right through his head. Again, these tamping rods are about 1.25 inches in diameter. This one was 3 feet long and weighed about 13 pounds. Okay, so here's what happens like immediately after the incident. Okay, Gage, his men, because he was actually like the foreman on the line. They gather him up and they carry him to the road, and they seat him in an ox cart, right? And he's taken to his hotel in downtown Cavendish where they're laying this rail, and he rides in the ox cart sitting totally upright, fully erect, 3/4 of a mile. He rides sitting fully erect on his own as he marks his men's hours in his notebook. He's talking to his men. He gets out of the cart by himself. And later, with a little bit of assistance, he walks up a long flight of stairs. Okay? So, this horrible thing has happened, and this man is kind of like, oh, it's just a flesh wound. It's a scrape. Like, no big deal. Now, this report actually comes from Dr. Harlow. He's reporting the story as told to him by Gage and Gage's men. Dr. Harlow was the second physician on the scene after the incident. Now, the first physician on the scene is Dr. Williams. He arrives about 20 to 30 minutes after the accident takes place. Okay, and here's some of his account of what happens when he arrives. Okay, so he says, okay, when I drove up, the patient basically said, doctor, here's business enough for you. Basically like, hey, dude, like, check this out. Okay. He says, I first noticed the wound upon the head before I alighted from my carriage, the pulsations of the brain being very distinct because, of course, lots of blood vessels going around the brain. So you're going to have pulsations as our heart frequently pulses. Now, Mr. Gage, during the time I was examining his wound, was relating to the manner in which he was injured to the bystanders. So he's like checking out this horrible hole in this guy's head. And, Finn is like talking to people, oh, you'll never guess what happened. It was so crazy. He talked so rationally and was so willing to answer questions that I directed my inquiries to him instead of the men that were with him at the time of the accident. Okay, so he's like, hey, okay, this guy is lucid enough that I can just ask him what happened. So Finn is telling him what happened, and he's like, no, I'm not sure that you know what's going on right now, because that could not have possibly happened, and you're sitting here talking to me. So he asks him where the bar went in, and Finn tells him where the bar, went into his face. He pointed to a wound on this cheek, right? So it comes in through his cheek over here. Mr. Gage persisted in saying that the bar went through his head, and an Irishman standing nearby confirms. He says, yeah, the bar's laying in the road below, all blood and brains. And he says he would have brought it up with him, but he thought there would be an inquest and it would not do. Obviously, this Irishman has watched his CSI, so he did not move any of the evidence on the scene, right? Good. So, about this time, this doctor is like flabbergasted in what he's hearing, and he's finally starting to believe it. Finn gets up and he vomits. The reason why is because he essentially has this hole, like the hole goes up through his cheek here, right? And it's passing through sinus. You'll get clearer pictures of what's happening here later. So it's passing through sinuses, and it's bleeding. There's obviously bleeding happening. And what's happening is some of that blood is running down the sinuses and into Mr. Gage's stomach. So about every, 15, 20 minutes or so, he's got to get that out of his stomach. Your stomach doesn't particularly care for blood. Unless you're like something out of Twilight. So he vomits, and the effort of vomiting presses out some brain matter. I'm not telling you all of this to like gross you out and make you vomit. I'm telling you all of this to make you understand sort of like the severity and the craziness of this wound, right? It's not just like, oh, tamping iron blew through his head. Okay, whoa, that's nuts. That's crazy. No, really. His brain was leaking out as he... Right, okay, so you can read that. Okay. His eye was damaged, and that's sort of like one of the lingering physical effects of this accident. Definitely because, the tamping rod passes right behind his left eye. So, the next guy on the scene is Dr. Harlow. And Dr. Harlow, the correct spelling of this, by the way, is this one, Dr. Harlow. This is not the correct spelling. So he shows up and he's like, I didn't get here until 6. There was another doctor here before that who I know. When I got here, he said that the picture presented was, to one unaccustomed to military surgery, truly terrific, as in terrifying, not like, oh, this food is terrific, as in like, no, terrifying. So the patient bore his sufferings with the most heroic firmness. Heroic firmness. He recognized me at once. Okay, so there's, that mental faculty right there. Oh, I can recognize you. And he said he hoped he was not much hurt. I know a tamping rod just blew through my brain, but, can I go back to work tomorrow? So, he seemed perfectly conscious, but he's getting exhausted from the hemorrhage, right? So he's like bleeding profusely. There's blood coming out of his brain, and it's flowing into his stomach and onto the floor and wherever else. So he's throwing it up. His pulse is regular, a fine resting pulse of 60. But him and his bed and everything around him is just saturated with blood. So they treat the wound, they shave the scalp. There are pieces of scalp that have to come off. There are other pieces that he actually repositions and puts back. And just to make sure there are no other fragments in the wound, the doctor passes his, index finger in there and sort of makes sure everything is good, right? Unheard of. Okay, so just process all of that. So here's some better visualizations, right? This has been on the left. He's holding the tamping rod that went through his head. You can kind of vaguely see on the rod there's an inscription there. It's because he did get it inscribed. You can see that his left eye is it's kind of permanently damaged, and he does, some reports say, go permanently blind in that eye. So in the middle, there is a cast of his head, and this is done shortly after his accident. He's still alive here. And you can clearly see where the damage is in this cast, right? You can actually also see some of the damage happening here on his cheek, right? So this tamping rod sort of blew up through this way. Now this is obviously post-mortem. There's the hole in the top of his head. Not a whole lot of damage seen down here, and it's because this guy got really lucky, right? It went right under that, like the mandibular, is that what is going on there, the mandibular joint, or maybe that's like the, anyway, it went right through here. So, right, lucky guy. Now here's a couple more visualizations, right? This is a demonstration in, it's on display at Harvard. The brain that you saw before is actually on display at Harvard as well. That is his skull, and they have it there at Harvard. And here's another demonstration. Here's the, tamping rod through the skull, just for some perspective. This is a reconstruction of what was going on, what might have happened, actually, if we could like see the passage of the rod through the brain. So you can tell it's very frontal. It's very near some language areas, right? But we don't see any sort of alteration of language with Phineas. Now, short term, his recovery was great. Everything was fairly normal. Coordination, movement, language. His senses were pretty primarily preserved, except for he loses vision in one eye, but that's pretty good considering the extent of the injury. He loses his top left molar, and he's got slight paralysis on the left side of his face, right? But that's fairly good short-term recovery for an incident like this. Excuse me. So pop culture belief is that Gage basically turned into a monster, that his frontal lobe was damaged, and the whole seat of your personality is right there in the frontal lobe, and phrenology. So if you look at like here, this excerpt is by the American Phrenological Journal of 1851, and essentially what happens is they write an article because another doctor named Bigelow says, hey, I don't know what everybody's talking about, because Finn's character really wasn't changed that much after the injury. Like, yeah, he had some problems, like, directly after the injury, but he recovered really well. And we know this because his family tells us that recovery was fairly good. We know that he actually traveled down to Chile to drive a stagecoach down there. He was down there for 7 years. They said that there's no way that with the kinds of problems that doctors were reporting that he had, that he would have been able to hold a job, to interact with stagecoach customers, successfully. Like there really wasn't any way. About 7 years after he went to Chile, he had some impairments sort of return. He started to have some seizures, which is pretty understandable. Pretty lucky that it took as long as it did for the seizures to set in. And the seizures are actually what finally took his life. So this is just a record of his death here, with his cause of death being epilepsy. Right? So, the American Journal of Phrenology really was really eager to say that, if we remember correctly, the Aaron passed through the regions of organs of benevolence and veneration, which left these organs without influence in his character, hence his profanity and want of respect and kindness, yada, 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 right? So there's this whole idea that, functional specificity. Phrenology was sort of in its heyday, And people really wanted to believe that this is located here and that's located there. And if these things are true, therefore Finn must be this way, right? His character must have changed like this because these particular areas were damaged. So think about this. It's a really cool story, but how does it relate to methods? How does it relate to localization of function, as I just kind of alluded to? What would we learn if this happened today? If Finn were like living today and something similar happened, would we learn more from this injury today, given the methods that we have now, than we did when it happened? Why do you think the personality change myth persisted? Okay, these are all good food for thought questions, food for interactions. Think about it, and I will see you in the next lecture. I hope I didn't gross you out too much with some of those details. Forgive me. I'll see you in the next lecture. Okay, bye.